Story 1. Not so much what I saw, but what I experienced. I was once underway in the Gulf of Alaska during a November gale. Waves were up to 35 feet, with some rollers hitting 45. An uncommon occurrence on the diesel-electric ship I was on was a cycloconverter tripping. When this happened, the ship would temporarily completely lose power and propulsion until some electricians could reset everything. This happened during that gale. I simply can't explain how strange it is for the boat you're on to all of a sudden go so quiet that you can clearly hear waves slapping the ship and metal bending and flexing, knowing you're completely at the mercy of the sea. Knowing that if the ship lost its bearing and went beam to there was a real possibility of capsizing. It's easy to forget when you're at sea that the only thing keeping you alive is a bunch of steel welded together. At that moment, I was fully aware, and it humbled me. Thankfully, we trained frequently for this and had everything fired back up relatively quickly. Another time I recall was when the ship took a rogue wave. They are absolutely real, and I believe they account for a massive number of shipwrecks. It was late at night and I was on the bridge. We were passing through a storm and were taking the waves off the bow with no visibility. As the ship moves, there's normally a pretty standard pattern. You ride up a wave for a bit and then you fall down the wave for a bit. Well, we started riding up a wave and got to the point where we should have been starting our ride down, but we just kept climbing and climbing. And then it happened. We started our ride down the back of this massive wave. All of us braced ourselves and tried to find something to hold on to, but we all fell to the deck anyway. Anything that wasn't secured for sea fell down all around us. Manuals, tables, computers, printers, you name it. Our captain, who was sleeping, called up to the bridge asking if we hit something. It woke the entire crew up. Rogue waves are real and they're terrifying. I can't imagine being in a smaller boat or taking one of them broadside. Story 2. I was in the United States Navy for about 10 years and have tens of thousands of miles at sea on an aircraft carrier. Countless nights on the flight deck in the middle of the night and the middle of the ocean. Creepiest. A huge patch of the ocean glowing. Like nuclear waste in The Simpsons glowing. I've seen bioluminescent algae of a few kinds and this was nothing like it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Weirdest thing, hundreds of miles out to sea from land and there was a massive fire on the water. It was like the top of a gas refinery, but on the water with nothing under it but water. Flame going a few stories into the air. Saddest. A fellow sailor trying to jump overboard. He apparently got a Dear John email and pictures from his cheating wife and decided to end it. We were on the smoke deck, he bummed a cigarette, then asked the time. We said 11 p.m. He replied, "Sounds like a good time to die," and in one motion tried to launch over the chest-high wall with an opening to the water below. Luckily, we were faster than him. We grabbed his legs and wrestled him down and laid on him and basically hogtied him until the master-at-arms got there. Broke my heart because he was a good dude. I never saw him again. He got transferred off the ship shortly after. Not sure what happened to him, but I hope he's doing better. Funniest. 2 flying fish collide mid-air. I was smoking when we were in the Persian Gulf and saw the fish fly from a pretty far distance towards each other. I remember thinking, there's no way they're going to hit. Then splat, splash. I was in tears laughing, but no one saw it. Everyone just thought I was a weirdo, but I got to see a miracle of nature. Story 3. The furthest I've ever been out to sea was bay fishing, so I'm not qualified to say based on my personal experience. But one story that scares me is of a Chinese submarine that got caught in an eddy. Ocean eddies are like enormous whirlpools. They can be at or below the water surface. Some are large enough to be seen from orbit. Anyway, this submarine was caught in an eddy and was beginning to drift downwards towards crush depth. Obviously, that's pretty scary, but what drives it over the edge for me is that the eddy was pulling them downwards in the direction of a trench. Since they were in a submarine, they couldn't just see outside. It's almost like there was something in the trench that grabbed them and started pulling them down into the abyss. They jettisoned and eventually were able to break free before their submarine was crushed and lost to the dark void forever. But the idea of your submarine suddenly stopping, going in reverse against your will, and then realizing that you're headed towards an oceanic trench is just next level for me. I'm pretty grounded, but the ocean gets my imagination going. This powerful submarine got caught by something and started getting dragged down towards a trench. Yes, it was an eddy doing it, but the imagination comes up with disturbing questions. Story 4. Some 20 years ago, on the motor vessel Explorer, since sunk, down near the Antarctic Circle, sailing around the icebergs and occasionally making landfall, we rounded into a small bay area. There, among the ice and coast, was an unmarked sailing yacht, which is odd as generally yachts have some identifying markings on them. To add to it, they didn't respond to any radio contact, and while I wasn't privy to the conversation, and it was a long time ago, some crew went across via Zodiac boat and were refused boarding. So, basically a yacht, not a particularly large one, that was unmarked was hanging around in the inhospitable waters of the Antarctic and didn't want any help or contact. Properly weird. Story 5. Not creepy, but totally weird. 2 Chinese boats, like small, old, fishing vessels, meeting up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean like half a mile behind us. This was so random, within international waters but so far away from China, I still wonder what they were doing there. They had no automatic identification system. The first one to arrive close by passed next to us as if to check who we were and if we were keeping course, sailing vessel, and then went straight towards the other ship and connected. Maybe drug trafficking or maybe just fishing, but yeah, still pretty far away from their most likely official harbor and kind of weird. It was literally in the middle of the pond, around 10 degrees north of the equator, so not your typical fishing route. Story 6. I used to be an oil field diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I would say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night, mostly 500 feet and under dive support vessels. It's a very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing in-water decompression in the middle of the night. I would always ask the surface team to turn off my headlight, like a worm on a hook, just bobbing in the darkness. Story 7. Somewhere in the Atlantic, on a nice cold night, I decided to step out and look at the stars. About 10 minutes later, a boat's mast appeared, stayed there for a few minutes, and then went back under. No alarms, nothing. Just some submarine boys getting a bit of late-night oxygen in the middle of nowhere next to some friends. Story 8. I am a recreational sailor who travels for weeks at a time at sea. I once saw a flame on the water not 10 yards from me, just burning at midnight. Story 9. This sort of qualifies. Former Navy here. Somewhere off the coast of Italy, I saw a very, very small boat, not much bigger than a rowboat, about 9 or 10 miles offshore. This was sometime around midnight. There was no light from land and no other ships around. It had a light. Our ship captain said it was a fisherman, and the fish would be attracted to the light at that time. Imagine being in a rowboat about 10 miles offshore in the middle of a pitch-black night, waiting to see what finds you. Story 10. In 20 years, the weirdest thing I've seen is other people that work out here. There are about 40% of the sailors who like what they do and are good at it. Another 40% are good at it but would do something better if the money was right. But there's another 20%. If they lived ashore for more than 6 months a year, they'd end up dead or incarcerated. There's no more west for them to go, so they went offshore and became our problem. Story 11. A dead human body. It was the tropics, and it wasn't in good shape. We turned it over to the authorities at the nearest land. There were enough teeth left to identify it by dental records. Here's hoping the man's family got closure. Edit. Altral 2010 is correct. The body was double-bagged and stored in the walk-in freezer until our next port visit. There was quite a bit of cleaning and decontamination involved, but that's the gist of it. Story 12. Not so much creepy as eerie, but being out in the blue at night in a lightning storm in a slack wind. The ocean was very flat, with no big rolling swells, just tiny little ripples. The whole world would be black, and then there would be a flurry of bolts, and the whole world would be silver. The ocean looked like nothing so much as aluminum foil that had been scrunched up and flattened out. The water looked like mercury, and all the little ripples made these very dramatic black shadows. Story 13. Creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong, and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, and when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point with sand all around us and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest though was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. It turned into a massive, delirious argument over where everyone was even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal, and the captain put us all in a terrible situation due to sheer incompetence. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights and they did not show up on automatic identification system. Suddenly they were gone. It was extremely creepy. Story 14. I was drinking in an airport bar and met a woman who worked as a commercial fisherman, on her way to Southeast Asia for rest and relaxation with her family. Real salt of the earth lady. She regaled me with stories about her work, all the good stuff about working in her world, all the reasons she kept doing it for decades. I asked her what the scariest thing she saw out on the open ocean was, and, without any hesitation, she said, "Oh, an underwater unidentified flying object. I saw one rise up out of the ocean next to my boat and fly off into the sky." The matter-of-factness of her answer bothers me to this day. Story 15. Years ago, my friends and I visited Thailand and went on several excursions on a boat with a captain. On one of the evenings, we were out at night, and it was pitch black except for the green lights coming from the large commercial fishing boats way out in the distance. We stopped for a while to take in the view and eat when it started to rain. The captain thought it was best to head back and quickly realized that the boat propeller wasn't working, as something was caught on it. He grabbed his head-mounted flashlight and a knife and jumped in the water. He was gone for a good minute, which felt like eternity as we huddled around, trying to figure out what was happening. Fear started kicking in as we waited. Then he suddenly re-emerged, panting, and told us that shortly after he jumped in, he lost his flashlight and had to literally feel his way underwater towards the propeller, reaching and cutting a plastic tarp that had wound itself around the propeller, cutting it loose, and made his way back to the surface in the dark. It was a strange set of emotions as we were completely impressed with the impressive display we just witnessed, relieved he made it back, but also freaked out imagining what would have happened if he hadn't. Story 16. I was in a glass-bottomed boat in the 1970s off the coast of Oahu. We were going out to see a pod of whales. The boat captain was a grizzled old Hawaiian, sun-baked to the color of mahogany. It was an older boat, retrofitted with a glass bottom and bench seating. He was narrating over a public address system as we left the dock. We motored out for about 30 minutes, and the view out of the bottom of the boat was disappointing, just long streams of bubbles obscuring the view. Finally, he stopped the boat, and the view was simply amazing. The captain pointed out a pod of whales about 1/4 of a mile away. They were cavorting about, diving and jumping. The captain was explaining their behaviors but keeping his distance. It was pretty cool. All the whales suddenly dived and disappeared, emerging moments later right next to our boat. They were swimming all around us, diving and jumping and splashing us with water. Children were laughing. Everyone thought it was part of the show. They were right there, almost so close that you could touch them. The captain told us how lucky we were to see them up close. Suddenly, the mood changed when they started bumping up against the hull of the small boat. People were sliding all over the place, some fell onto the floor, and children were crying. Most telling, the captain had stopped narrating and had a look of abject terror on his face. I remember thinking about what it must take to make this guy scared, and as he looked terrified, we should probably be too. Suddenly, as quickly as they appeared, the whales disappeared. They were just gone. People picked themselves up and sat back down, mothers consoled children, and we started back to the dock. The captain got back on the public address system and tried to downplay the seriousness of what had just happened. But there was a definite quiver in his voice as we headed back to shore. Story 17, right. Long-time lurker, first-time poster here. I am no longer at sea but used to, as a younger chap with romantic ideas, spend months on end on cargo ships. Mostly tankers, crude oil, very large crude carriers, and refined product tankers. But with a little time in oil and gas and towing, I came ashore in 2017 with a Master Unlimited ticket, sailing as chief officer. My last ship was a self-discharging bulk carrier. Anyway, I digress. It was not so much about what I saw, which was creepy. I saw plenty of interesting things I would not have seen anywhere else. However, I was second mate on a tanker distributing refined oil products around the coast of New Zealand. A yacht had sailed from a port on the east coast, bound for another port just down the coast a bit, but it had disappeared. Solo sailor on board, aside from his dog. Nonetheless, the search proved fruitless and it was suspended. However, for weeks afterwards, at about 1:30 in the morning, the Rescue Coordination Center would broadcast a plea at the end of the weather and navigation warning broadcast asking for the yacht to make contact if it could hear the message and was able to do so. I would sit in the dark, chain smoking and working on my 7th cup of coffee, looking out into the black, imagining the guy who had a stroke or heart attack on board with the same broadcast playing out on his radio while his dog ate his face to keep from starving. Or imagining him having fallen over the side, imagining what it would be like watching your yacht sailing indifferently off into the distance with your dog in the cockpit pacing and agitated, unable to do anything about it. Knowing you were doomed and had a matter of hours, if that, left to live before the cold got you or exhaustion. Or imagining the dog starving and dying on a yacht by itself weeks later, listening to the same broadcast in the dark. The places your mind goes in the dark by yourself. They found the yacht in the end. The dog was still alive.